Good afternoon. We're so glad to have all of you here. Good afternoon and welcome to our fall lecture series. My name is Lucy Wilkins and I'm the Director of Museums at Washington and Lee University. One of the privileges of this position is to be able to tell the story of the remarkable contributions that both George Washington and Robert E. Lee made to higher education made to higher education through this university. If you are unfamiliar with this story, I encourage you to take time after the lecture for one of our tours and to digest the content of our museum, so beautifully curated by Pat Hobbs. If you would like to become a friend of Lee Chapel, please talk to our shop guide downstairs. Let me encourage you to see our other museums while you're here on campus, the Reeves Museum of Ceramics and the Watson Galleries. In the Watson, we have two important exhibits right now. Breaking the Chains, Ceramics and the Abolition Movement, is a groundbreaking exhibit of ceramics used to further the cause of abolition in the 19th century. Spanning the Generations features the family portraits of Martha Dandridge Custis Washington, and just a part of the portraits you see there are just a part of the collection of rare early American portraits owned by W&L. I am very excited to introduce our speaker today, who is also my new boss. Dr. Lynn Rainville came on board as our Director of Institutional History on July 1st. She has been charged by the Board of Trustees to present the history of Washington and Lee University comprehensively and accurately to our students, faculty, staff, alumni, and the public. She will help us develop a new museum that will cover the 270-year span of W&L's history and its connections to American history. Dr. Rainville is a public historian and anthropologist. She has done extensive research into Virginia history in several different eras, including World War I. She holds a BA in anthropology and history from Dartmouth and an MA and PhD in anthropology and archaeology from the University of Michigan. She has held teaching positions at the University of Michigan, Dartmouth College, and the University of Virginia. Most recently, she was the Dean of Sweetbriar College, where she was responsible for the collection's academic programs, history museum, and art galleries, and presided over a multi-million-dollar budget. As director of the Tusculum Institute for Virginia History and Historic Preservation at Sweetbriar, she partnered with the Department of Historic Resources for the Commonwealth of Virginia. Preservation Virginia and other historic agencies, she also worked with them to preserve the region's historic assets and promote the use of Virginia's historic legacy as an educational resource. She also worked with students, faculty, and K-12 teachers to provide education and outreach to the wider community and region. Dr. Rainville is a Community Initiative Fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Technology in the Humanities. As a public historian, Dr. Rainville lectures widely on topics ranging from the history of African American cemeteries to Virginia's role in the Great War. She has served as director of a number of historical projects, including a study of World War I memorials in Virginia, an ethnographic and historic study of an antebellum plantation, and a survey of African American cemeteries in Virginia. Her current work in Virginia history includes a survey of town poor farms and an effort to locate and preserve slave graveyards in the Commonwealth. She has received numerous grants and fellowships from organizations including Virginia Humanities, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Science Foundation. Her research has been featured in a variety of online publications and blogs, as well as on National Public Radio and in newspapers including the New York Times and the Washington Post. She is the author of 4 books, including Hidden History, African American Cemeteries in Virginia, Virginia and the Great War, Mobilization, Supply, and Combat, 1915 to 1919, and Invisible Founders, How 2 Centuries of African American Labor Transformed a Plantation into a College. In her spare time, she is working on another book tentatively titled The Destitute and Forlorn, the Widow and the Orphan, 3 Centuries of Poor Relief in Virginia. Dr. Rainville is married and has 2 lovely twin girls. In just a short time, Dr. Rainville has become a part of the family at Washington and Lee. We are delighted to have her at the beginning of this new era in the history of the university. She will be speaking today on the topic At Home with the Presidents, an ethno-historic study of the everyday life at the Lee House. So please welcome Dr. Rainville.
Thank you so much, and thank you for taking time out of your lunch to join me today. So what I want to do with today's talk, because I too am new to the university, is to show you some types of evidence that we use as historians, as archaeologists, and as anthropologists, and apply that to this fascinating structure and the people who lived in it here at Washington and Lee. So, but first, making sure that everyone is not sleeping through this, a pop quiz in terms of who lived in the house, in other words, for the longest, and who lived in this house for the shortest period of time. And we have all sorts of knowledgeable people in this audience who probably know the answer to both. It's actually harder to answer who lived in it the longest. Does anyone have any guesses? Here, this will help. There's probably a handful of people in the audience who can recognize this person by sight. It's President Francis Gaines. So President Gaines, who was the longest serving president, by definition then lived in the House the longest, and the person who lived in the House the shortest, using an anachronistic photo just to hold you in suspense for one more second, would be Robert E. Lee. And I will get into the story of why it was not the full 5 years of his presidency, but that it was a much shorter period of time that he actually lived in that house. Well, the anthropologist in me, when I started looking at this house, I always like to start at the beginning, and so for me, that of course is the overall context of the lands where we are right now. Many of you will probably recognize this is an excerpt from a very famous map by John Smith, and north is to my left. So in other words, you're following the rivers here. And if you look at the words Monacans, that's because we are today in the ancestral homelands of the Monacan people. And although research is definitely ongoing into their history and their settlements here, to illustrate and annotate this map for just one moment, Montesupacanaw is a site that has been excavated. It is located roughly in modern-day Charlottesville, again along the river. And the other important feature here, which we have in Rockbridge County, are these that Smith is illustrating with mounds. The Monacans, their burial practices included these accretional mounds where they would bury their dead. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson makes a reference to these mounds and people visiting these sites in the 18th century in his notes on the state of Virginia, which tells us there are actually multiple sources of evidence that show us that although Native peoples were being displaced throughout the 18th century as European American counties were being formed, they were still working through a variety of rituals, and then to this day, of course, there are Monacans and other Indian tribes scattered throughout the Commonwealth. And here, for perspective, we would actually be off the map. So we're not quite on the map, but there were burial mounds here in this area. So if we fast forward in time, after thousands of years of native inhabitation, to this 1755 map, which, again, roughly to orient us in terms of where Washington and Lee is eventually situated. The location here, there are lots of reasons for why the Scotch-Irish selected this area of Virginia, and a lot of it has to do with rivers and areas of transportation. So when you're stuck on I-81, you can blame hundreds of years of transportation routes. This has been an area for the canals, for the railroads, and of course today for interstate highways. So in the 18th century, and what I'm doing with a lot of these images, in the bottom I'm including the date that the image was actually drawn or photographed. Because, of course, I don't always have the visual image of exactly what campus looked like for the time period I'm talking about. So if you'll forgive me a little bit of that juxtaposition, I will be highlighting in every image what it is that's chronologically pertinent to the story. And what's pertinent here, and to this I owe a debt of thanks to the archaeologists, Don Gaylord and Allison Bell, for some of their research into recognizing that there are two important features in this sketch drawing. Here is roughly the modern day location of the president's house, and this is the location of the Liberty Hall, what today are the Liberty Hall ruins. But as many of you will know from your history of W&L, the Liberty Hall ruins, after Augusta Academy and then Liberty Hall Academy had moved from Augusta County to Fairfield, and then as it was established here on what today is the back campus, that was then in the late 18th century the equivalent of the front campus. So that was the structure at Liberty Hall that was used for 10 years to educate Washington, then Liberty Hall Academy students until it burned. And then it was in the burning in 1803 that a landowner named Andrew Alexander, who was living in the area where the blue rectangle is, that he agreed to swap his land. So Andrew Alexander moved himself, his plantation, and dozens of enslaved individuals to the back campus, and then the scholars and their faculty and the rector moved to what is today the front campus. So you have a switching of the landscapes. And all of this is just that context for why eventually this site is selected as the home of a new construction for the president. So just before I get to the construction of what is initially Lee's house, a quick consideration of where presidents were living up until that house was constructed. So the presidents associated with Liberty Hall Academy were living on that, what today is the back campus, in and around Mulberry Hill, and some of their former residences have been excavated by archaeologists here for decades. And then on the front campus, as we move into the era of Washington College, one of our presidents, Henry Ruffner, who was president between 1836 and 1848, when he first became president, he was in part living at his own family home in Lexington, which is shown on the left-hand side, so a structure that was not on campus. And it was under his presidency in 1841 that they first, as part of a larger building spree, they built a home for the president. And that is what today is called Simpson House. So then under the last half of Ruffner's presidency, and then under George Duncan's presidency, that was the president's house. Which is, of course, very important to realize when you're going through the remarkable collections in the archives, that if it's late 1860s, and they're talking about the president's house, they are not talking about either the location or the structure that is today Lee House. So if we move to the construction of the house and the catalyst for that of course is just after the war, as Robert E. Lee is offered and accepted the presidency. Well, as many of you know part of the story, Robert E. Lee, when he was approached by one of the trustees, he was at Derwent, which he had been kindly offered as a bit of a respite after the war. It's a plantation home along the James River. And he was there when the judge visited him, and I'm showing a picture of the house because all of these houses are what Lee would have had in his mind as he went to consult with the architect and then the builders to build his house here on this campus. And as you may or may not realize, Lee himself had never spent very much time in any single house, partly because his father died when he was young. He had been born in Stratford, but then he had moved multiple times, and then as an Army officer, he had been moving across the country for multiple assignments. So it was actually his wife who had spent decades in one house, in Arlington House, but he had a very mobile background, and here at Derwent, when he was staying there, Lee himself described it as a comfortable but small house in a grove of oaks. His daughters who were staying there with him were not as complimentary. They talked about the profound silence of the country. And this becomes an ongoing theme about unfortunately, his fourth daughter had died in 1862, but that his three surviving daughters had mixed feelings about living in rural settings. So when Lee arrives in 1865, and again, this is actually an 1857 view, so off by a couple years, but it gives that bucolic sense that Lee would have welcomed. His quote that it's a beautiful spot by nature, man has done but little for it. An absolutely beautiful site. And here in this image, the Lee house is not yet constructed, and instead, roughly in that spot, is some of the plantation era buildings. Well, he arrives on campus in September for the opening of the new session, and he is initially staying at the University Hotel. So he has traveled by himself from Derwent, which turns out to be a 3-day trip. It remains very difficult to get to Lexington until long after the railroad spur comes here. So it takes him 3 days, and he wants to go first so that he can arrange for a proper setting for his arthritic and wheelchair-bound wife before she's going to come. So he's staying temporarily, and the trustees then, the reason why they're waiting and he can't initially go into this house, what is the president's house, is because during the war, it was rented out by a medical doctor who was having troubles finding another place to rent just after the war. So he was dragging his feet, and Lee did not want to call for his family to join him until he had moved out of the hotel and into the president's house. Unfortunately, when he moved in, Lee complained that it was in wretched shape, and along with many of the women of Lexington, they came and fixed up that house for him, what it was then the Junkin house. In that house, by the time he calls for his family, which is in December, and at that point, for all sorts of reasons, some of his sons are busy at their farms, one of his daughters at a wedding in Richmond. So initially it's Mariana, his wife, Mildred, one of his daughters, and then Rob Jr., who come. And interestingly, one of the few pieces of furniture they had at that moment was this new gift, an 1866 piano that had been made and expressively given to Robert E. Lee in part as a marketing ploy by the piano maker. And this image on the left is just, if you look closely in the bottom of the picture, we're so used to seeing this just beautiful, iconic colonnade, and I'm always searching out these pictures that capture the true, not so much asymmetry, but up through most of the 19th century, there were dozens and dozens of other structures, which are long since ruined or taken down to create what today is, a very stately lawn. It was always stately with the addition of the colonnade, but that there was a lot more going on here in terms of outhouses, outfeatures, and outbuildings. So this is the college that Lee arrives with his family. And in part with his engineering background, one of the first things that he does is he takes on the committee work of a Buildings and Grounds Committee very seriously and is very engaged in this research. This is a map from 1868 that he in part called for so that he could start to organize the buildings and the properties and take care of things like fences and a myriad of other buildings that had fallen into disrepair during the war. Now, in 1868, here are the initial plans for the chapel, and I should say that although Lee it became very important to him to build a new and larger house for him and his family, his priority the minute he arrived was to build a chapel, a freestanding chapel, which you see on this map. And then the second part of this was his efforts to build a house for himself, for the president. You will also notice on this map that there are these outbuildings that I've been mentioning behind several of what were then the 4 faculty houses, with the president's house being the last one. So in this letter, Lee writes to his family, and it's in part this reference to all of the different tasks. I mean, in addition to being president and trying to raise money for the school, that it is very important to him to get the landscape right. And so again, I'm cheating a little bit because you'll notice the date of this plan of campus is after he himself is dead, but what it shows that some of the other 1860s maps do not are the complex gardens that were planned behind each of these houses. These do not remain today, but this was part of Lee's vision. And we know from letters and correspondence that although they didn't probably take this highly symmetric and organized structure or form, that while he was living there, he and or servants were regularly maintaining a garden. Because, for example, he talks about bringing a rose in to his wife on most days from their backyard garden. So President Dudley, the pressure's on to have a really good garden. So as I mentioned a moment ago, Lee took on, he did end up, they hired an architect, they hired builders, but he was heavily involved in the planning of this structure. And as a result, we have to appreciate what some of his influences were. And certainly two of them were his wife's home, Arlington House, and then where he had been born at Stratford. So if you keep these images, especially the chimneys at Stratford, in the back of your head for a moment. As part of the process, and as we go through trustee minutes from this era, in the back and forth, the decision is finally made to hire an architect and an engineer at VMI. He was also a deputy surveyor for Rockbridge County, so he had a lot of background. This was the plan that he came up with, the bird's eye view plan. And you'll notice if you look carefully that there are these three, they're actually meant, they're the doors that go out onto the porch. And if you'll notice, they are wider than many of the other interior doors. This was to allow Mrs. Lee in a wheelchair access to that wraparound porch. And this was clearly one of the architectural elements that Lee was very particular about to ensure that that basically it was an ADA compliant home for the 19th century. Which was certainly ahead of his time. In terms of the design of the house, this is one of those really fascinating moments. You can't always pin this down in history this precisely, but many of you will know that there were literary societies in town that had lending libraries. One of them was the Franklin Literary Society, and they kept a record of who checked out books, and it was this book by Rich, the 1857 American architecture book, that was checked out right in 1867, and in with his designs is this particular image, which is in part the model for Lee House. As I mentioned, the next step was to put out bids for builders, and this is the advertisement in the Stanton newspaper to put out the bid to try to find someone to build it. By August of 1867, the trustees had contracted with Poland Shields to build the house. And in addition to the house, there were other features that were explicitly stated, and this included a greenhouse, a cow house, the woodshed, some of those gardens that I mentioned, and then this cat house, which was just behind the stable. Mildred, one of Lee's beloved daughters, was very into cats. They all had names, and they were constantly, it sounds like, producing more kittens. So there were a lot of cats to house, even though if anyone has ever owned a cat, you know that doesn't mean that they would actually stay in any of those houses, but it was a nice idea. I should say that $15,000 was set aside for the initial construction, which in one of those online calculators for the worth of that today, it's roughly $271,000, just to have a context, which $271,000, the equivalent in post-war Virginia, is really quite an investment in a house. So Lee was very involved, again, bringing to bear his own engineering background and his own experience in different houses. These are some of the design features that he is credited with. As I mentioned before, so that is Stratford up on the top, and which has its own unique chimney features. And here at Lee House, they were clustered into the center to help with air exchange. He also set the windows back very deeply with shutters to help with cooling and then heating. As I mentioned, he had the wraparound porch on 3 sides so that his wife could easily get in and out of the house. I mean, not down to the ground, but could be outside for the fresh air. And in letters back and forth with his family, he and his wife were often talking about how valuable that was to her, that she wasn't just confined indoors. And part of this feature was the sunroom that's still there, of course, today on the west side of the house, which Lee felt so strongly about that he originally had offered to pay for this out of his own money. And after it was constructed, the trustees were so happy with the final design that they reimbursed him for that. And then one of the more interesting features was to create running water, the equivalent of gravity-fed running water, by putting a cistern up in the attic, and so that water could flow with gravity. This is not, though, the same, they did not have indoor plumbing per se, so in other words, they still had an outhouse out back. Well, Lee is also quoted, and this goes to, again, the fact that he really didn't have, there weren't many places where he ever felt that he was at home for any period of time. So his quote was that, "This is the only house that I have ever built, and it must be right." And here are just some excerpts, including the beautiful detail on some of the doors, the wraparound staircase, some of the portraits and artifacts. I should note that the household belongings that came from Arlington House were wrapped up in a series of legal, after the war, a series of legal proceedings, so none of those, Mrs. Lee was not able to retrieve those items except for some carpets and some curtains. So as I started looking into the construction of this house, I was interested in some of the architectural features and the different structures. So here, for example, these are all the materials that went into building the privy at the back. That cost $150, well worth it. This is the description for the various windows, and you'll notice partway down next to the number 6 that there were windows in the outhouse. Not exactly sure how many windows you think you want in your outhouse, but apparently it had some extra ventilation. And then, as I mentioned before, Mrs. Lee was always at the forethought of the design, and so there were pulls throughout the house, pull bells to call for servants, that were deliberately put at lower levels so that in her wheelchair she could reach them. On the far left-hand side, she would hand tint watercolors to sell them for charity. And this is, the third image is the doorway that leads out into her sunroom. And if you've ever toured the house, you will have appreciated that it is an extra wide doorway that she could have gotten out into that room. Well, I was interested in another series. Well, actually, I was interested in anyone who lived in the house during this time period. So, as I mentioned before, certainly you have Robert E. Lee and his wife living there full-time after it was constructed. But then if we turn to the 1870 census, we also see that in addition to Lee and his wife, and at that point 2 of his daughters, Agnes and Mildred, are living with him. There's also 4 African Americans, and this, for me, is the start of what will certainly be ongoing research for each of these individuals in terms of their occupations and their contributions, and then their family connections more broadly to Lexington. And what I'm showing here on the right-hand side, this is the back stairs that went up to the servant quarters where these individuals lived, at least in 1870, within the household. And in this aerial view, you can see this is the structure that's out behind, not the stable, but the other structure behind the house. And in fact, this was planned for from the beginning by the architect in terms of the kind of division in the house going from, in the front lower right-hand corner, the public parlor to the dining area, and then Mrs. Lee's room on the left-hand side of the house, and then servant quarters and a kitchen in the back half. So again, this is certainly not comprehensive, but starting to look into the lives of these other individuals who lived at the house, 2 of the names that I pulled out, Henry Stewart and Sarah Dixon. The reason why I have question marks on their death dates is that normally the way I would find this out is to locate their gravestone, which I have not yet had a chance to do. But one of the many reasons to share these names, even at this early moment in research, is the hopes that people in the community are familiar with some of these surnames, know descendants, because that's actually easiest and the fastest way to collect information about individuals is to connect with modern day descendants. So this is just from initial research, what little I've been able to reconstruct about at least 2 of these individuals. And the pattern that I want to point out here is that Henry in 1900, he's still living here in Lexington, whereas Sarah Dixon has moved to DC. And her movement to DC has to do with a lot of complex late 19th century movements, including the establishment of the Jim Crow laws, where for some African Americans, they decide to move to the north and to other sites. I would note that in the paperwork and the records for building the house, there's also mention of really dozens of other African Americans, including Alex Briggs, who even in a pre-war census is listed with his last name. He was a free man, and he was working as a carpenter on campus, and his name reoccurs throughout the 1860s for various construction projects. And the Norris family, who are on this is now an 1869 accounting reference to people being paid for their services, and then both Norris brothers are listed here in addition to several other African Americans. And I should note in each of these are all coming out of special collections, that it actually can take quite a lot of time to figure out who is African American because they're not always indicated as such. This was actually one of the clues. If you look carefully, you'll see Columbus Nash is the name of the individual, and in parentheses is the 19th century term colored. So this was certainly an initial clue, and then I can double check with the census. But all of this takes a long time to sort out who these folks were and what their jobs were. Here's another scrap of paper that simply says college hands. So certainly you have to be familiar with that expression and what that means, and then looking through these names, connecting names that are sometimes listed with last names, without last names. So it's a massive genealogical project, but will help us understand better who was in this house and who was contributing to the everyday chores and tasks. Well, I've put some of the other people who lived in the house after this because it was really Robert E. Lee and his wife who lived there the majority of the time, then the servants who were there full time, and then of his children, because they were of course adults by now, they were most of the time they were not in permanent residence. So here the person who spent the most time is George Washington Custis, because of course in the same summer when Lee Sr. was being courted to accept the presidency, his son independently was interested in teaching engineering at VMI. So even though after his father dies, George Washington Custis, of course, becomes president of Washington College, and then changes the name to Washington and Lee, that was not his first love, and that was not the reason why he was here in Lexington. So he was working at VMI while his father was still alive and coming back home often to share meals. And then the other sons were visiting at various moments when they were working on farms out east along the James. His daughters also, Mildred was the daughter who lived in the house the longest because she stayed on as a hostess for her brother after her father's death. Agnes lived in the house. Unfortunately, she died just a few years after her father did, the same year that her mother did. And then Mary Custis was basically a world traveler, and she did come to stay in the house, but most often she was on the road traveling. Well, the daughters were the source of a lot of discussion and gossip, as you can probably imagine, 3 unmarried women coming to Lexington right after the war. And obviously I haven't and I won't be going room by room in the house because I hope that you will join the docents on a variety of tours that we host throughout the year to do that sort of micro level. But I will point out this one room, a then and now picture, because this shows, this on the plan, this was the parlor on the right-hand side, which would be that public parlor for guests. And you'll notice, and if you've been in the house, you will notice even to this day, in the old picture, you can see the fabric that was there originally, but the fabric was also, there was a backup plan, which was the doors that would shut. And this allowed Robert E. Lee and his wife to be in the back dining room while their daughters entertained young men. And it, of course, allowed them to keep a very close eye on the proceedings. And the story from multiple sources, including the letters of his daughters, tell us that at 10 o'clock each night, if there was a visiting suitor, Robert E. Lee would call time, and the suitors had to leave, and if they didn't, he would take the place of his daughter, send his daughter off to bed, and he would sit there until that young man left. So this plan of the house allowed him to do that. Well, to move us forward in time here, of course, on October 12th, just an anniversary just a few days ago, in 1870, after catching basically a cold in the rain, attending to college business and then vestry business at the church, he came home. There are differing accounts in the weeks that then led up to his eventual death, whether or not how coherent he was and what he would or would not have been able to say out loud. But unfortunately, this was a sickness. This was a multi-year illness that had been catching up with him in terms of heart disease coupled with now pneumonia. And it was after his death that images like this in national newspapers, that the house embodied the memory of Robert E. Lee for quite some time, and of course it was no accident that the trustees had turned to his son, who is, if anyone has read any part of George Washington Custis's own letters or thoughts on the matter, I mean, he really was, first and foremost, enjoying being a professor at VMI, so he took the presidency here out of a sense of duty, but that was not his own first choice, and in fact he had tried to resign 5 different times until he finally resigned, George Washington Custis Lee, in 1897 as president. So to keep us on time, I will now go forward and look at a couple other eras here in terms of who is living in the house. So we have Custis, who lived in the house then much longer than his father did. And here in his 1880 household, here he is with his family. But if you notice, on either side of his own entry are African Americans, in this case living at next door. If you look carefully on the left-hand side, I've had to crop this so that we could see it at all, but on the left-hand side, for those of you who have looked at census records, you'll know that the small numbers are indicating the individual dwelling numbers, so each time there's a new set of numbers, it's a new physical structure. Now, we would have to, or I and hopefully students here at Washington Lee will have to do a lot more research to figure out physically when census takers decide there's a new dwelling, that, for example, could be one of the standing outbuildings, if the census taker determined that they thought that was a separate family. So there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of physically where individuals were living after 1870. But you'll notice one interesting point, right below Custis's family is a woman, Mary Moore, who's a 13-year-old African-American girl. And if you have really good eyes, you'll notice that the census taker is always going numerically in order in terms of dwelling numbers. But her dwelling number is completely different. It's 50 houses away. And when I looked into that, that's because she is actually living in a boarding house with other African-American laborers, laundresses, carpenters, etc. So in this case, it is unlikely that she's living full-time in Lee House, but that she is working there full-time. And I should say, this is not normally the way the census taker is supposed to do this, so that in and of itself is an interesting question, because normally when people, they're working in someone else's house, they're only listed in their own structure, not double counted. So during Lee's presidency, here to use a late 19th century image and then to narrow in on what the house was looking like, again, there's been externally very few substantial changes, and the original footprint has only been changed very, very slightly with the modern day addition of an accessible ramp on the back side. So there's been remarkable architectural coherency here. Many of you will know, if you've done research into census records, that in 1890, because of fire, it's very rare to have the 1890 census, so I can't say explicitly right now who is living in the house, but I can infer, because we know from other records, that for 12 years Custis employed a valet, a man named William Price, and we are fortunate to have some of the wedding china that Custis gave to Mr. Price as a gift when William Price got married in 1895. And that is in the Reeves collection here at the museums. And Mr. Price is buried nearby, and indeed named one of his children Robert Edward. And initially I had assumed, well, in terms of who he's naming, who Mr. Price is naming his child after, presumably Robert E. Jr. President Wilson, as I mentioned, President Lee, Custis Lee, stepped down in 1897, and although President Wilson was only lived in the house for 3 years, he lived in the house when he was still there in 1900 when the census taker came through. And in this case, interestingly, he is not employing servants in his household, so there's a bit of a demographic shift here. But I should mention that while he is not employing servants directly, there are African Americans every time I'm looking at the census having to do with the professors here, the president here. There are African Americans living in structures, houses, some of those houses in the pictures that I was showing earlier, houses on the edges of campus, contributing in a myriad of ways with different occupations such as cooks, waiters, boarders, laborers, carpenters, and blacksmiths. And then to end with President Gaines, in the interest of time, so he, as I mentioned at the very beginning, was the longest serving president and thus wins the award for having lived in the House the longest. And now, in terms of a new chapter for the research, here you have him and his family living now without other servants living in the house with him. And what I've highlighted here in blue, these last names, these are not, so now keep in mind, this is the 1930 census. So now we're decades after the end of the war and after that period in the 1860s when I was showing you the names of African Americans working on this campus. But I've highlighted surnames that are the same as those individuals from the 1860s. So in other words, now the research would be to connect and see what the family connections are, if any, or if it's just a coincidence. In a small rural community like this, it's unlikely to be a complete coincidence, but in terms of how they're related, that would be ongoing research. And it was under President Gaines that the house was renovated. This was when electric light fixtures were updated, and that was the largest upgrade until President Huntley came, and then there was yet another full renovation, and then subsequently there have been other moments with renovations, especially to the kitchen and what you would expect in a house as the decades, as technology improves and you have different needs and living styles. So with 2 minutes to spare, I want to emphasize what I said at the beginning, that this for me, not only am I new to campus, but this research into this house, this was very much taking on, basically challenging myself to try to do this research in very short order so that I'd be ready for today. But what I immediately learned from even the beginnings of this research is that there are so many other stories here now to pursue, including interviews with other past presidents and spouses and family members who are certainly still alive, and several of whom are still part of our community. So if you were waiting for that oral history, that is still a very valuable lead that I also hope to encourage some of our students in various history and anthropology classes to pursue further, because even from what little I know of the other stories, and there are many more stories about living in that house, this is how we kind of flesh out that everyday life experience, and those stories tell us a lot about the history of this university. And so I look forward to doing that, and then owe a great deal of thanks to the individuals listed here who are faculty, staff, students, and members of the community. And that is what it will take to continue in my new role to understand our history better and our context within Lexington, Rockbridge, and this region. And with that, I will end, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
If you would like to ask Dr. Rainville a question,
Crenshaw spoke General Lee's college, that at some point in time, the Lees had visitors, and in the evening, which was the tradition, some shoes and boots were left outside the guests' room, thinking they would be polished about breakfast. And General Lee, roaming around the house, saw them, and he didn't have enough servants, certainly not roaming boot black to polish them, so he polished them and put them back in front of the door. I always wondered, and I suspected it was the former Lee Jackson house that they were living in, which they, instead of the current Lee house. Would that be a good supposition?
So I haven't heard that story yet, but I have no doubt. I mean, again, there are so many letters to read through here. But I would say yes, just statistically speaking, of the 5 years that he was president, it's only the last 18 months that he lived at Lee House. So most likely, statistically speaking, it would have been at today's Simpson House, not in the Lee House. But I will add, we do know that after the Lee House was constructed, one of the other things that he did, there were lots of, not just visitors, but people spending the night there. He was offering up rooms to, he called them yearlings, but some of the students. And then he was constantly inviting members of his more distant family, not just his children, but cousins, especially young female cousins, to come visit. So there were a lot of people at Lee House coming and going as visitors.
Someone else?
Well, I would then simply say that to encourage, I know there are more of you in this room who also have anecdotes that help tell this story, and encourage you to reach out to myself to share those stories or point me in different directions for different resources. Because again, this is a kind of community effort to collect these stories and to make sure they're kind of organized in one place so that people can continue to learn from them and then pursue some of these new research opportunities. And with that, thank you very much.